Happy Friday afternoon, January 17th. So my name's Karen Houle. I'm in the Department of Philosophy here, and it gives me great pleasure to welcome Dr. Shannon Hoff for our first Speaker Series lecture of 2014. Dr. Hoff is an associate professor of social and political philosophy at the Institute for Christian Studies in Toronto. Lots of you know her, but some of you don't know these things about her. Shannon was on sabbatical this year, and she has been the visiting fellow at the Institute for Cultural Inquiry in Berlin. That sounds great. She's also president of the Canadian Society for Continental Philosophy, CSCP. I've known Shannon for quite a few years. We have some overlapping interests. She specializes in feminism, social and political philosophy, and continental philosophy. In particular, it's wonderful to hear that her first book, that's entitled The Laws of the Spirit, A Hegelian Theory of Justice, sounds great, will be published by SUNY Press in April of this year, so we're looking forward to that. And the title of her talk this afternoon is Rights and Worlds on the Political Significance of Belonging. So please join me in welcoming Shannon Hoff.
Thanks, Karen, and thanks to the Philosophy Department for inviting me to speak this afternoon. It's nice to see so many people here, and it's nice to see people from so many different areas, like ICS, Guelph, and so on. So yes, without further ado, Rights and Worlds on the Political Significance of Belonging. Modernity is characterized fundamentally by an assertion of the individual as a singular unit of significance. It has taken shape around the demand that respect be accorded that individual, whatever her values, beliefs, or qualities. The modern world is populated with various systems that are intended to suit the priority of this individual. A legal system that protects her capacity for self-determination in the face of the determining powers of others. An economic system that protects her capacity for making a living in the way that she decides. An apparatus of political authority that answers to her capacity for self-governance by affording her a say in governance, and by preventing her from being dominated by the private interests of others. A system of education that takes responsibility for the development in her of basic capacities. And finally, a kind of global civil society that extends beyond particular communities, groups, and nation-states, and asserts the individual's significance in a kind of absolute sense by declaring her human rights, and so detaching her from any given community's appraisal of her. In all of these ways, modernity involves an assertion of the priority that the individual be able to live on her own terms. The modern liberal political framework exemplifies this priority by positing that its legitimacy relies on consent, and it expresses respect for consenting citizens by granting them rights, mechanisms they are entitled to wield as claims on it. These accomplishments of modernity are enormously significant, and they correspond to a fundamental sense that we have of ourselves. To be an I, that is to experience oneself as a point of orientation in the world, as that through and to which the world makes itself known. It is, as Kant has described, the inevitable accompaniment to any manifestation of significance. In a sense, everything answers to the I, insofar as it is the medium through which things appear and through which the meaning of these things can change. To be an I is to be unable to deny or subvert the existence of one's own perspective as the context in which things appear. Modernity's illumination of the undeniable reality of the I, and its organization of social and political reality in response to this I's inevitable self-asserting presence make it a profoundly important development in human history. Despite the importance, however, of modernity's insight into the priority represented by the individual I, there is something also fundamentally partial about this insight, and about the political discourse that emerges around it, evident partly in the frequent failures of these various systems to do what they purport to do. That is, we can identify a disparity between the way the individual is portrayed by the modern liberal discourse of rights and a key aspect of her own experience, that experience to which the liberal framework takes itself to be answerable. This is a disparity between the way in which the liberal discourse of rights recognizes the individual as discrete and decontextualized, and the way in which her experience is constituted meaningfully by virtue of her involvement in worlds of significance or domains of value that she does not construct, to which she relates in an essentially passive way. It is a disparity, as I will call it, between rights and worlds. What matters to human individuals is not simply their capacity for self-determination, but the fact that other phenomena can appear as meaningful and important to them, demanding recognition. Such phenomena, namely, as intimate others, the things they are involved in studying and learning, their family networks, their involvement in group activities, their religious commitments, their opportunities for creative expression, and so on. Human lives are rendered meaningful by the specific activities in which they were always involved and the context of identification to which they belong, by the existence of specific worlds that take shape in their own way, according to their own logic, not simply as produced by individual human choice. Given this aspect of experience, care for these domains and accommodation of passivity to them is an important ingredient of the sustenance of meaningful human lives, and, as will become evident, important even for the effective operation of rights. The modern liberal political paradigm is no stranger to criticism. Marxists have opposed it by drawing attention to the ways in which human lives are shaped powerfully by material forces that compel them to class-based behavior and choices. Communitarians by shedding light on the powerful impact that our specific communities have on the human orientation to value and meaning. Feminists and critical race theorists by revealing the influence of social evaluations of identity on our access to power. Developmental psychologists by tracing the human development of agency through our original embodiment and involvement in intimate relations. Post-colonial critics by challenging the prejudicial conceptions of freedom and agency implied by the liberal view, which have been thought to be implicated in destructive forms of intervention into other social worlds. My aim in this paper is not simply to take us through this terrain again, but to introduce a new way of talking about what is missed in the modern liberal view that both captures the true insights of these various critical approaches to liberalism under one basic rubric, that of the political significance of human belonging to worlds of value, while also acknowledging and retaining the powerful accomplishments of the modern liberal political revolution. In what follows, I will discuss the disparity between the individual identified as a rights bearer by modern liberal political discourse, on the one hand, and, on the other, her experience of herself as a recipient of significance and a participant in particular worlds of significance, the scope and nature of which she does not individually determine. In so doing, I will illuminate both the partiality of the discourse of rights and the way in which it can effectively work against the individual person by undermining the effective operation of worlds of significance upon which she relies and to which she belongs. Further, I will elaborate how the discourse and mechanism of rights can be supplemented with a political discourse and set of political mechanisms that are more appropriate to these aspects of individual experience, arguing for an approach to political life and social organization that does not abandon, but supplements the extraordinary accomplishments of the liberal modern political revolution. So my first section is called Involvement and Passivity. In order to develop a language for talking about the significance of involvement and passivity in the constitution of human experience, let's rehearse some specific observations of modernity made by contemporary philosophers grappling with their own sense of its significance. Charles Taylor, for instance, observes that the modern liberal framework operates in terms of, quote, the revolution of modern subjectivity, a consciousness of the individual as simply a man, and as significant for that reason, neither as Athenian nor Spartan, German nor French, Jew nor Gentile. Jürgen Habermas claims that in modernity, quote, religious life, state, and society, as well as science, morality, and art, are transformed into just so many embodiments of the principle of subjectivity. Its structure is the structure of a self-relating, knowing subject, end of quote. C.B. Macpherson describes the modern conception of the individual as one that construes him essentially as, quote, the proprietor of his own person or capacities, owing nothing to society for them. Further, political society becomes a calculated device for the protection of this property and for the maintenance of an orderly relation of exchange, end of quote. While obviously not an exhaustive account of what is involved in the modern political revolution, I refer to these descriptions so as to illuminate that which modernity does not capture or acknowledge, indeed that which it had for its own very significant reasons opposed. That is, being Spartan or Athenian, German or French, Jew or Gentile, typically does matter to the individual. Further, her reason, her moral judgment, and her creative power do not make science, morality, and art, but are the capacities by which she can be affected by and participate in these independently real and powerful forces. And finally, her social environment makes certain possibilities and styles available to her and contains various resources that she uses to develop. Its activity is essentially prior to hers. In other words, in various ways, the individual lives inside of broad worlds and structures of significance. And she is able to live a more or less meaningful individual life because of the various forms of involvement she has with these worlds and structures. The involvement of belonging, of participating, of enacting, of mattering, and so on. She develops the capacity for meaningful activity as a consequence of being passive, both to their formation and cultivation of her, as well as to their meaningfulness. She is cultivated and shaped by a specific family and culture, for instance, and she finds herself compelled by logic, by beauty, by conscience, by the sense at work in natural organisms, and so on. All of which are available to her partly by virtue of the existence of particular social forms, such as educational institutions, museums, hobby groups, and thus by virtue of a stable social environment and a developed cultural history. We can discern here various kinds of involvement and various kinds of passivity. There is involvement that is substantially formative and unchosen, that is effectively discovered once it has already been underway. And there is also involvement that is undertaken in a more voluntary way as an opportunity for development and expression, but also defined essentially not by the individual herself, but by the body in which she participates. There are related kinds of passivity, a kind of ultimate passivity reflected in the fact that one becomes a person through the agency of other persons and groups that one does not choose. And also a kind of relative passivity, reflected in one's dependence on the existence of meaningful things, on mattering to other people, and on existing social structures, none of which one invents or controls. The specific domains in which human beings participate and the others with whom they associate take shape independently of these human beings' preferences. And indeed, they shape these preferences. Even when an individual begins to want to shape and change these domains and these others, she is equipped to do so by virtue of her very involvement in and with them, their prior influence on her. The possibilities that she has for development and transformation are a product of their influence. The world she belongs to and inside of which she lives are central to her, as are the values not made by her, valuable precisely insofar as they are not simply the effects of her will. We should note here also the way in which these contexts typically orient themselves to the individual, for it is not the formally inclusive and neutral kind of orientation that we might expect of law in the liberal designation of human beings as formally identical. Many of these contexts are effective precisely because of their status as exclusionary, as partial, because of their preferential attitudes toward the individuals whom they cultivate and empower, and toward the activities that they enact. If such contexts were absolutely inclusive and indifferent to the specific individuals they included, they would not be able to function. A Latvian community center, a sports team, an art gallery, a family, a homeless shelter, an LGBTQ support group, all require for their operation the creation and enactment of limits, and must rely on preferential treatment and exclusion, even in the context of being motivated by the ideal of equal human dignity. While such individuals may desire favor and preferential treatment, they cannot simply choose or force it also, but are dependent on the wills of others for it. In various ways, therefore, we can see that the stance of the individual as a discrete subject is an accomplished stance. Self-determination and self-differentiation are secondary to an original embeddedness in and belonging to meaningful wholes, whose characteristics and qualities provide the ineradicable ingredients of self-constitution. Our involvement in and passivity to these meaningful wholes allow us to develop as discrete, competent individuals, and we both have and want this kind of involvement and passivity. We are oriented toward contexts that are oriented around us, such as families, around particular ideas and interests, such as scholarly and artistic worlds, around specific activities, such as sports and crafts, around specific beliefs and commitments, such as religious and activist communities, and so on. In her own self-enactment, the individual both implicitly and explicitly points to the value of those worlds that extend beyond her, and to their orientation toward her as a uniquely significant participant in them, worlds in relation to which she is in some fundamental sense passive. So we have explored this issue from the point of view of the ideas of involvement and passivity, which express the individual's relation to the various domains of significance, the worlds in which she finds herself. We could develop this analysis further, however, and give names to the various ways in which the individual is tied to these worlds of significance, identifying the units of which the individual is an integral part and out of which she emerges as an individual. First, there is an organized material reality in relation to which we develop the basic bodily engagement that lies at the root of our development, which I will call intermateriality. Second, there are specific people whose attachment and commitment to us cultivate us as beings who can take up our existence in an active way, which I will call intersubjectivity. And third, there are particular contexts that make specific kinds of activity available to us, which I will call contextuality. Let's explore each of these elements in more detail. First, every human being emerges as an agent through interaction with a basic material reality, developing a capacity for movement, a sense of differentiation from external reality, and a basic bodily intelligence through interaction with external objects and space. With this bodily development of agency comes a sense of self. I am the one who can walk from the table to mommy, for instance, who puts food in her mouth, and so on. And I become the one who has a bank account, who gets a job, who pays a mortgage, who is laid off during a recession, and so on. All of which are practices enacted in and through specific material realities. To be a person is to be passive to a specific material reality and a specific set of material conditions, out of relation to which I emerge as the specific individual I am. To be a person, that is to be defined by intermateriality. Second, I am attached to specific non-substitutable people who will never be neutral with regard to me and my identity. And I in turn form further attachments like these that shape in me further habits and qualities in relation to which I find myself answerable. To be a person is to have had a history of such attachment to which one is to some extent passive, and it is also to continue to form these kinds of attachments. While we develop a greater capacity to choose our attachments, even though, as many who study the psyche have shown, our choices in this matter are often a neurotic repetition of patterns established in early interaction, we also, in a sense, value our passivity to them. That is, we want to have been formed, cared for, and cultivated. And upon our formation, we want again to be chosen, desired, the recipients of attachment who experience the claims of others upon us and do not choose them. The meaningfulness of the attachment of others to us depends to a great extent on their decision to ally themselves to us. If it were our choices that caused the attachment, its meaningfulness would be at least diminished. To be a person is to be fundamentally defined by being with others, by an intersubjectivity that is not solely defined by ourselves. A third aspect to be noticed in this idea of a meaningful whole is that it is delineated in terms of contexts, and that we develop in the multiple ways that are supported by such contexts, taking on the roles that are appropriate to them. The context of my culture, country, school, family, team, cafe, job, and so on bring me into being as an Arab, a Canadian, a student, a son, a volleyball player, a quote-unquote regular, a social worker. Indeed, their power in shaping me as answerable to them is attested to by the fact that who I am in one context can seem incompatible with who I am in another, even though it is I who participates in each. The people in the cafe I regularly frequent, for instance, may be surprised to see the ways in which I fulfill my responsibilities at work. Further, the power of these contexts in shaping us as answerable to them is also attested to by the fact that interaction with others from different contexts is often quite challenging. And this interaction is often more effective when we take the significance of contextuality seriously. To be a person is to be a participant in various specific contexts that support specific activities, that allot to us specific roles, that produce in us specific skills, and that constitute us as answerable to them, even if our answerability to some contexts conflicts with our answerability to others. To be a person, that is to be fundamentally defined by contextuality. This analysis highlights the significance to us as human individuals of the formative and compelling force of the material world, of other people, and of specific contexts. But it also leads us to a specific understanding of the nature of meaning and value. That is, the meaning and value provided by materiality, by others, and by contexts come largely from them, not from our choice of them or our estimation of them as meaningful or valuable. While we may typically understand ourselves to confer meaning upon things, to designate things as valuable, to convert inert matter into significance, in short, to be active with regard to meaning and value, we are to a great degree passive with regard to meaning and value. Instead of sending out the force of estimation, we are ourselves compelled by phenomena. They enact upon us a compelling force, and we become who we are in the process of recognizing and answering to them. To truly operate toward something valuable as valuable is explicitly not to be the origin of its status as valuable, integrating it into a system of values that one has oneself fashioned, but to be passive to its compelling force, to find oneself turned in its direction, commanded by it, converted to it. Indeed, if things were made valuable solely by our choices of them, they would not really strike us as valuable at all. Our valuing of various aspects of reality is properly understood as a response to its call to value it, which resonates in a way that we do not invent or circumscribe. Nevertheless, even though what matters is not simply a product of human willing, determined solely by the choice of the individual to whom it matters, we find our willing and choosing to be called for and to be important in response to it. There is a sense of agency operative here, not simply passivity. There is a sense of the significance of one's will, but it operates as a kind of response. What is prior to this response is the fact that there exist opportunities to become sites in which what is valuable and meaningful can appear as such, can be identified. In our responsiveness to and care and preservation of what is valuable and meaningful, whether it be activities, projects, other people, objects, and so on, we become people of a certain constitution and character. Instead of locating human value and dignity in our capacity to be self-determining, we could locate it here, in this very capacity to be a site for the preservation of meaning and value. To be a human agent is, we might say, to be capable of a reflexive turn toward the conditions under which we live, and in relation to which we are able to have meaningful lives, and to enact concern for these conditions. The discussion thus far is intended to reveal a disparity between the way in which individuals are conceived of in the modern liberal framework and the way in which their experience unfolds. The individual unit of significance to which modernity points as a priority, which it to a certain extent accomplished, itself points to other units of significance, to intermateriality, intersubjectivity, and contextuality. This individual's experience witnesses to a different kind of significance than that associated with modern individuality. The significance of human passivity in relation to what is valuable or meaningful, and the significance of belonging to and participating in worlds and contexts that allow human beings to have something to do and to value. The notion of rights operates on the basis of the assertion of the significance of human activity and on the basis of the centrality of human beings, as opposed to those worlds and contexts in which they act and to which they belong. It does not explicitly identify and protect the domains in which human activity occurs, and it does not explicitly recognize the importance to human individuals of being receptive and answerable to those worlds and to what is valuable in them in a way that these individuals do not themselves determine. Even though the individual's access to broad contexts of significance is protected in principle by the notion of rights, and hence those broad contexts are at play in principle and implicitly in a discourse of rights, they are implicitly conceived of only in terms of her agency, and their actual existence, the existence of these worlds, as well as her passivity to them, are not thematized. When the individual status as an individual is given formal priority, the reality of these worlds of significance is implicitly concealed. To politically recognize the individual as such is to, in a sense, erase the history of her emergence, the way in which she comes into being as a kind of abstraction from a more primordial, contextual, interpersonal, and intermaterial situation. the situation of being involved with the world in a way that is generative of her specific identity. To give formal priority to individuality is to divert attention from the fact that each individual develops as such in specific, qualitatively charged worlds in ways that she cannot choose, toward the agency of which she does not generally relate as an autonomous, defining individual, and whose preference she relies on if she is to develop. It is valuable and important to her that she be passive in relation to the various worlds of significance to which she belongs and with which she is involved, that they unfold on their own terms and compel her with their significance. For her to be posited primarily as an agent of value is for her to be tied to terms that effectively impoverish her and shut her off from the event of significance. This phenomenological foray through the nature of human experience has been articulated in terms of the ideas of involvement and passivity, the concepts of intermateriality, intersubjectivity, and contextuality, and a consideration of the way in which value operates, a set of ideas that I've gathered together under the notion of world. Now we shall continue in a briefer part 2 by identifying several ways in which the significance of these extra individual worlds of value could be given political terms, or could reshape our approach to contemporary political reality. I will identify several strategies here. The friendly revision of existent aspects of political reality, such that they might better accommodate insight into the significance of worlds. The criticism of existent aspects of political reality in the name of the idea of worlds. And the development of new political mechanisms that would better answer to the significance of worlds. So, section 2, revision, critique, and reconstruction, expanding rights, protecting worlds. A first way in which to transform our approach to political reality would be to revise the ways in which specific aspects of the modern liberal political apparatus operate. For instance, the ways in which we describe our relationship with rights and the different forms of agency they support could be transformed so as to render this discourse less at odds with our status as passive recipients to and participants in extra individual worlds of significance. This would be a matter of a transformation of the common ways in which rights are explicated and invoked, namely as claims against one's worlds, or as assertions against others. It could involve something like the following. Rights support the possibility of meaningful interaction with reality and each other, in asserting that our value is detachable from our specific characteristics, and thus in encouraging us to refrain from interpreting each other on the basis simply of our culturally inherited stereotypes about these characteristics. With their power in separating our individuality from the terms of our communities of formation, rights allow us access to other worlds of value and domains of interaction. When various communities decide that others are less valuable, when they inculcate in us a certain kind of blindness to forms of value beyond those with which we are familiar, rights have the capacity to protect and illuminate such values. Further, in assuming the existence of rights, we testify to our consciousness, our shared consciousness, of shared human dignity and mutual responsiveness. And the notion of rights cultivates that responsiveness in us when it is insufficient. Finally, rights have the potential to enlarge the scope of our responsiveness by leading us to imaginatively identify with worlds and domains of value that are not immediately our own. They can cultivate our capacity for answerability, our openness to the appearance of new value, our capacity for excursions into a broader world. These capacities of the discourse of rights should not be elided by critics and defenders of rights who can sometimes portray rights in ways that render them much less other-oriented than the above description. But we should also note that limitations to the discourse of rights remain, that changing the way we describe and invoke rights is not the sole solution to these limitations. That is, we misrepresent the nature of these extra individual worlds of value if we construe them as existing as a consequence of individual choice, instead of as the very realities that sustain and enable that choice. The language of rights will always speak only partially and indirectly about the nature of these worlds, because of the ways in which they stand expressly for individual human agency. To have a right is to be construed as a being who actively determines herself and who has a formally recognized capacity to demand treatment of a certain kind. While this implies a functioning social system through which self-determination could be actualized and specific demands satisfied, indeed, through which such an individual who has such capacities can be produced, it does not instruct us in creating and supporting it. Too strong an expression of the authority of this discourse in our social and political life can have deleterious consequences for our capacities to produce what it requires. Further, since the modern liberal paradigm is dedicated to the individual and to the idea of her authority, it is in principle also dedicated to a consideration of what she would elaborate as her terms. If she experiences her various attachments as meaningful and valuable, then to conceive of agency as detachment from them is to undermine her possibilities for living on her own terms. Since this was precisely what the modern liberal framework purported to enable, it is inadequate, again, on its own terms. Another revision, internal to the already established idea of right, would involve a shift of privilege from civil and political rights to economic, social, and cultural rights, which testify more explicitly than do civil and political rights to the significance of extra-individual domains of value. In pointing to the importance of sustaining access to a developed and resourceful world, these rights imply the existence of such a world, suggest that attachment to it is intrinsic to human existence, and demand that independent resources be committed to it. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights is an example of this. Article 25 specifies that we have a right to a standard of living adequate for health and well-being, which includes food, clothing, housing, medical care, and necessary social services, etc. Article 26, that we have a right to education that shall promote understanding, tolerance, and friendship among nations and groups. Article 27, that we have a right to participate in the cultural life of a community. Although these rights are infrequently adjudicated, their enunciation is positive insofar as it underlines the physical and social resources required to sustain choosing individuals. However, with little political discourse devoted to the elucidation of the worlds and contexts of human significance, such rights lack an effective supplement. Their existence is a kind of symptom of the one-sidedness of the liberal project, which cannot fulfill its own demands. Another related revision of existing political terms in the name of extra-individual worlds of value is found in the UNESCO-sponsored Declaration of Human Duties and Responsibilities, also called the Valencia Declaration, which commemorated in 1998 the 50th anniversary of the Declaration of Human Rights. The Valencia Declaration identifies responsibilities to the context of significance in which human beings are situated, aiming to effectively protect the worlds required for the satisfaction of rights. Article 9, for instance, identifies the significance of the protection of a safe, stable, and healthy environment. Article 10, the promotion of an equitable international order. Article 15, the building of an ethical society. Article 16, the ensuring of meaningful participation in public affairs. And Article 38, the fostering of arts and culture. The intention of the Valencia Declaration, as its authors claim, is to move away from the freedom of indifference toward the freedom of involvement, to identify the necessity of cooperatively sustaining the context of involvement, and to highlight human interdependence and mutual reliance on the worlds of action and interaction. The coexistence of these two declarations, that of human rights and that of human duties and responsibilities, provides at least one model for thinking about the nature of human life, experience, and value, in that it goes some way in capturing the double-sided nature of human identity as active and passive, independent and dependent, free and answerable. Thus far, we have identified ways in which existing political terms could be reconceived and revised in order to better reflect the significant way in which we are passive to value and dependent on the development of contexts that sustain agency and afford meaning. There are also, however, political phenomena that stand in the way of the sustenance of domains of value, and political mechanisms not yet existent that could better support their sustenance. Since there is no reason to assume that the revision of existent terms is radical enough to accomplish transformation on its own, and does not also require criticism of these existent terms and the creation of new ones, let us address these second and third avenues in turn: criticism and creation. One form of criticism called for by the idea of extra-individual worlds of value involves identifying and challenging that which threatens their existence. If human life is sustained by such worlds, then we are made vulnerable through their vulnerability. And we protect our vulnerability not simply by invoking our non-transgressible rights, but by empowering these worlds and asserting their non-transgressibility. We protect the possibility of meaning and value as such by sustaining the domains that have the capacity to afford them, the familial and social structures that cultivate us, the contexts of interaction that bring us into contact, the institutions that record the accomplishments of history and make available the activity and accomplishments of art and other mechanisms of value creation, the structures of economic sustenance and exchange, the religious organizations and spiritual practices that can remind us of our status as recipients of value, and the natural world itself. The analysis thus far suggests one mechanism for the protection of such worlds. That is, given that they operate in a sense prior to the operation of individual self-determination and personal choice, and given that this very priority is a condition of their effective operation, they should be protected from being subordinated to the operation of private interest and individual choice. In other words, the domains of value and significance that effectively sustain the possibility of individual choice should not be subordinated to that choice. If human agency depends on certain kinds of contexts, and the continued existence of such contexts requires that they be relatively impervious to the determining power of choice, then making the human capacity for self-determination the ultimate value can result in the opposite, namely in a basic alienation from and destruction of the capacity for self-determination. If there are domains that belong to no specific individuals, but that precede and sustain the existence of such individuals, then they require protection from appropriative self-interest, and they should not be made primarily answerable to that interest. This is not the same as saying that they cannot be criticized and transformed by individuals. Having insight into possible reasons for transformation of such worlds is not the same as taking something over and making it into an instrument of individual satisfaction. The protection of worlds against appropriative self-interest, of course, itself requires specific institutions and practices, such as those specifically designated with the task of upholding the common interest, namely government, its ancillaries, and its agencies. Thus, another task for critique in the name of the protection of such domains of value, to put it briefly, is to challenge any tendency of government to support the power of private interest and use its influence for the selective enrichment of a single powerful class. In the name of these worlds and their goods, this tendency is also unsuitable and unjust. The existence of such domains of value is also threatened through excessive reliance on the legal adjudication of rights to resolve the tensions and difficulties that come up in the context of human interaction, which also, therefore, demands criticism. The modes of resolution that are characteristic of such legal frameworks are not neutral and indifferent with regard to the production and shaping of domains of value. They can be used to eliminate or disallow much of the productive and transformative ambiguity that comes along with human interaction. To rely too much on legal rectification is often to avoid developing the skills of interaction that come from complex negotiations in interaction. The ambivalent character of law in this regard should be noticed, and the significance and transformative power of interdependent and ambiguous life with others should be appreciated, even while the capacity of law to protect and free us from the destructive influence of domains of significance should be recognized and upheld. In addition to the task of revision and the task of criticism, there is one final and third task suggested by this analysis, namely the creation of new political mechanisms and structures that would better answer to our reality as passive or receptive to value not of our own making, and to the experience of significance that results from involvement. Here all manner of specific policies are possible, but for the moment I will simply identify a general principle. Political resources should be oriented toward the production and sustenance of contexts by which value is transmitted and which cultivate us as receptive. Initiative and agency should be exercised for the purpose of producing worlds, institutions, and contexts in relation to which we could be passive, in relation to which our capacity for production, self-determination, and independence is not taken to be the utmost priority, or becomes a priority only on the basis of recognition of a prior passivity. One clear example here is, of course, specific kinds of educational and cultural institutions and practices. our passivity to which is clearly required for our development of agency. Domains such as these should be created and protected from the capacity for human agents to undermine their own conditions by presuming that value is a product of their own individual creation and a matter of their own individual evaluation. There should exist political support for contexts in which we have the opportunity to experience ourselves as recipients of knowledge, meaning, and value that is not attached to our given interests and not attributable to our creative power, in response to which we could find our lives enlarged and enriched. There should exist political support for worlds in which we can experience ourselves as transformable, not simply on our own terms and by our own initiative. To acknowledge such worlds is to respect, in a communitarian vein, the significance of the worlds of human cultivation, but also, in a more critical vein, to acknowledge the many possibilities of transformation that exist in involvement and interaction. It is to respect the past and the future, worlds as forces of cultivation, and worlds as locations of transformative encounter. Given that in developing such worlds we are committing to the idea that our priorities as individuals may not take center stage, such ventures are risky, but the opposite carries with it a risk as well, that of the arrest and erasure of significance. Conclusion. While the idea that we, as human beings, have rights is and has been an immensely powerful and appropriate and important idea, we should not be conceived of as having rights to ownership of and extension into domains, the preservation of which is necessary for the very existence of rights in the first place, since it is on the basis of these domains that we exist, act, and have things to value. Further, the idea that human beings have rights should not lead to the detriment of the contexts that sustain the possibility of meaningful human life and interaction. The activity of individuals relies on a fundamental passivity in relation to the worlds of value that sustain them. Hence, rights require worlds. Since we are familiar with the fact that political violence has been committed in the name of a disregard for agency, it can be disconcerting to elaborate the notion of passivity in political terms and to give up, in at least some ways, the defensive assertion of agency. It is also true, however, that much of the significance of human life lies in its exposure and its openness to value and significance that it does not define, and thus that to fail to elaborate the notion of passivity is to risk that value and significance. This ambivalent situation is characteristic of human life. It is a situation of an ambivalent vulnerability that, on the one hand, affords meaning, at the same time as, on the other hand, it opens us up to the possibility of the destruction of meaning. To elaborate a politics of rights based on the protection of the individual as the one who makes her own value is to protect against the possibility of the destruction of her meaning, but to do so to the neglect of a politics of worlds is to pursue a politics of meaninglessness, to degrade the intermaterial, interpersonal, and contextual domains of our emergence and existence, and to undermine our own possibilities for agency and transformation.